Welcome to Los Angeles and USC. Looks like we have a good turnout and an exciting panel. I have some housekeeping stuff. I'm Steve Drummond, by the way. I'm the executive producer of the NPR Ed team at National Public Radio. And I'll be your moderator today. I'll introduce these distinguished guests in a moment, but I have some housekeeping stuff to do if I could. I'm told that if you're tweeting about this session, use the hashtag EWA18. During the Q&A, please identify yourself when asking questions. And you probably don't need me to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. And please make sure it is a question and try and keep it really short. We're going to be, you all know how quickly an hour flies by, and the goal is to, especially in a room full of reporters, to let you guys ask questions. So we're going to hopefully try and keep things moving, and our panelists will try and keep their answers pretty short and tight and try and get in everybody's question that we can. And then we want to move quickly between the sessions so that the next panel can start on time. We may have to get out or take our conversations out in the hall or whatever. I'm going to introduce our panelists and ask a couple questions myself. I'm pretty interested in this issue as well. We're here to talk about equity and the state of educational equity. That sounds kind of wonky, but we have a lot of cool stuff to talk about. But first, let me introduce our panelists. They all have super long resumes and distinguished careers, so I'm going to try and keep that short. You can Google them if you want to, but mostly I just want to kind of jump right into this. Howard Fuller, to my right, is a distinguished professor of education, founder and director of the Institute for the Transformation of Learning at Marquette University. Before that, he was the superintendent of Milwaukee Public Schools from 1991 to 1995, so kind of a think tank level view of this and also on the ground experience with many of these issues. Kathryn Layman is the chairwoman of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. President Obama appointed her to a 6-year term in 2016. She litigates civil rights cases at the National Center for Youth Law, and she's a former assistant secretary for civil rights in the education department until January of 2017. Pedro De Guerra is with UCLA. He's a distinguished professor of education in the grad school there and information studies. His research focuses on the ways schools are influenced by social and economic conditions, demographic trends in local, regional, and global contexts. He's written 12 books and jillions of articles and papers and everything. So, like I said, you can Google all that stuff. Take my word, these guys know this stuff and know the topic. We all met a week or so ago to just talk about this, and one of the things we talked about, and I'm going to just run kind of quickly, Howard, Kathryn, Pedro, we're talking about it in terms of schools in the United States right now, especially geared to a room full of journalists trying to figure out how to cover this for their local schools and their local communities.
Okay, so I think the major point that I would make is we need to distinguish between equity and equality because they're not the same things. And I think a lot of people talk about them and they use them as if they're synonymous. I'm using it with the understanding that people who are oppressed need more than people who are not. And to say that we're just going to treat everybody equal is inane. And so the reality of it is that the kids that I represent, the kids at my school, the ones that I just left yesterday after listening to their senior presentations, you can't talk to them about equality. That's not even real for them, given what they're dealing with every day. So if we're going to support equity, then in my mind it means that we're prepared to give people who have less more.
Okay.
To keep us moving, I
Yes.
certainly agree, and I think that it's important in this context and in this room for us to be thinking about schools as a place where we develop what equity means and where we develop what civic engagement means. And the schools in this country, any type of school they are the places where we build the citizenry and where we build who we will be as a country. So we need to be thinking about a way to make sure that every child receives a message that government believes in the child, supports that child, and is prepared to teach that child to achieve that child's dream.
So, and I'll just add, I like the very succinct explanation Howard gave. I just point out that we live in a very unequal society, and that inequity is driving educational opportunity. But we tend to only look at education in a vacuum. We don't look at the ways in which inequity outside of schools impacts schools. Moreover, we're one of the few countries in the world that almost everywhere spends more money on wealthy children than poor children. And that's a very consistent practice. We also, almost every city had private schools for the wealthy, public schools for the poor. So we have inequity built into education, and it's rarely acknowledged as the source of so many of the problems facing our schools.
One of the things, again, there's a room full of journalists here, and one of the questions I find interesting, you guys interact with them, you talk to them, your sources and their stories. What do you see when you read coverage of this issue locally and nationally? What do you see that you like, and what do you see that is a mistake or that could be better, or what are the things where you're like, oh, they didn't get that right? Anyone?
I'll start. I was just telling Gail, who's here, because she was writing for the Atlantic, how great the Atlantic is. I want to, anybody writing for the Atlantic, give it up, because they do real research, and they spend time to study, and they don't take quick, easy responses. They really probe the issues thoroughly. And I want to just commend that approach to journalism, because many of these issues are complicated, and it's so easy to just go for a quick, shorthand answer to a complex problem, which doesn't help anybody, and it certainly doesn't shed light on the issues. So I really want to encourage you to, even when we look at something like school violence, it's gotten a lot of attention because of the mass shootings, to really probe what are schools doing? Why is it that in the urban areas there are metal detectors, security guards, police officers increasingly, but in suburban and rural areas almost none, although that's starting to change, when most of the shootings have occurred in suburban areas. The racial dynamics of the school shootings almost never get covered as a story, when most of the school shooters have been white males. So the inequity issues, the race issues are almost always there, rarely brought to the surface. And because of that, I think we have a very incomplete understanding of what's actually happening.
So I see in this room some of my favorite journalists, and that's a pleasure in itself. And the kinds of things that I love to see in the articles that I read are articles that make accessible what can otherwise be wonky issues, and that really clarify who the students are who are affected by the policies that the article writes about, and how we got here, what's at stake. These are real people's lives, they're real people's expectations. And so driving home the desktop lens of what we mean when we talk about education, when we talk about equity, and what the high-level policy discussions translate to from the perspective of a student trying to learn in school. That's I think, what's most beneficial for any reader, and certainly helpful to people who know less about the topic than you do as experts when you write about it.
Howard, any thoughts?
Yeah, I just have one thing. I don't, since I've never been a journalist, I don't understand the pressures that are on you all, but the thing that bugs me is when people pick up stuff that's a lie and just continue to repeat it. Because you don't have time to go check it, and so you just use as a source that's bogus to begin with, and you just keep repeating the lie. And so, but I understand the other pressure, this and that. But at some point in time, you just want people to like check some of this stuff before you repeat it.
We were just talking about this on our team this morning, because the thing that we've been talking about for a long time is this word gap research that's been around for a long, long time that says in poor communities, the number of words spoken, and that this is, and apparently there's a study out today that's looked at that 10 years later and says, actually, maybe and so one of the things that we all struggle with in the room is that we kind of rely on researchers and academicians to, sort of source us, because we're not the experts on this stuff, and then that leads to a challenge. Anyway, it's funny that came up just today, what you were saying, in the context of a really important equity issue. We're probably going to try and write about this, figure out what we have to say about this.
Can
Yeah.
we just comment on that?
Yeah, please. I'd love to hear it.
That is a good example of what Howard just mentioned.
Yep.
So the original research said that there was a 3 million
Yeah.
word gap, right, between poor kids and middle class kids. And so kids were arriving in school so far behind. It was like, what can we do? These disparities are kind of baked into their lives. And I'm not a linguist. I didn't study this, but first of all, I know that poor kids don't live in silence, right? They're surrounded by language too, right? And I also know that if a white researcher shows up at your house to record your home, you might get silent, right? Especially if you don't know this person. And that's literally how some of the research was done, where researchers came to the house and recorded conversations. And so questioning the methods, because what were the implications of that? The implications were there were deep cultural deficits in poor children and poor families that were driving outcomes, and therefore, what can we do? Instead of saying, no, well, maybe there's something flawed with the research, and even if there are real differences in exposure, how much could high-quality preschool make a difference for those kids?
But I think too, the question is like, when Howard Gardner wrote Multiple Intelligences, I mean, the thing that he was trying to get across to us is that there's more than just one indicator of intelligence. And that if you start approaching people with a deficit analysis to start with, and you proceed to build your whole case based on your own ignorance of the assets that they actually bring to the table, what is it you expect to come out of that? And so I feel like our kids are many times victimized not by what they don't know, but by the fact that people are not aware of all the things that they do know, or the things that they know don't have value to those of us who have a totally different, way of viewing the world.
I think there's also a lesson here about the role and the responsibility that you all have in changing the world that we live in. The reality is that what you report is what people know. And so the thumbnail that you say in your stories, it is what gets received and how we all act on it. I mean, I will say, related to this issue, there was research, as I was becoming a parent, my kids are now 11 and 14, but there was research showing that in even college-educated black families, there are fewer books in the home than in any other class of families. And so my house, in response to that, is a library. I was like, hell no, will that be my children's experience, that they will not have books? And I don't know if that research is accurate or not, but I do know that I didn't want my kids to be learning at a time when they didn't have access to the books that the kids have. And so you can't sit in my house without sitting on a book. And I don't know if that's valuable for my kids, but I do know that I got that from an article that I read. So what you write is what we live. And there's an incredible responsibility to get it right, to go deep, to make sure that you are accurately depicting the lives that you're describing, and also to push for the change that you want. Because if you don't write about it, then we won't know about it as a country. And one of the frustrations that I had as a litigator here in Los Angeles before going to government was hearing when I was litigating about, in a case that Pedro and I worked on together, and I was litigating about equal access to educational opportunity, and a lot of reporters say to me, we already wrote about how kids don't have books. We already wrote about how kids' schools are unequal. So there's not news there. Well, it is new to the kid who's in school today, and it is a new problem that is not yet solved if we don't address what that equity is. And so that's something that I don't want you to turn away from. I do want you to describe the reality of the lives that you're reporting on so that we can see them change.
Awesome. So when we talk, one of the questions that I posed that you guys kind of got fired up was this one. It's a frustration that I have all the time is that, and all the people in this room have, is we're reporting on school inequity, and inequities based on education. And the whole, from Brown on, we decided to integrate one part of society, schools, but there's these other giant things out there, notably housing inequity, housing segregation, income inequalities. And so how do we get our heads around sort of reporting on schools without addressing these broader, giant, huge things that are out there?
Steve, I do want to say to you that at the same time that we decided that we would integrate schools, we also decided that we would integrate housing. We just didn't do either all that well.
Right.
So that is an independent problem that we also need to address. But I think as much as it's real that we need to be looking at housing segregation, we need to be looking at access to healthcare, the kinds of quality of life components that are part of the equity that our children do and don't receive in school, we also cannot lose sight of the reality that, and the research is inescapable on this, that schools themselves, independent of all of the factors of kids' lives, schools themselves can transform students' opportunity and outcomes. So there's a reason to be laser focused on school, and there's a reason to be laser focused on housing, healthcare, policing, criminal justice, the entire aspect of all of our lives. And if you got to pick one, go. But it doesn't really matter which one it is as long as you're working toward equity. But it's not that we have a commitment to equity in schooling that we lack someplace else in our lives. It's that we don't live that commitment anywhere in our social life.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Fair Housing Act, 1968. So 50 years, really good time to be doing stories about where we haven't gotten in that story. We just did one on the Code Switch podcast that I work on too. It was a really interesting discussion. You guys other thoughts on this?
So I think that the point that the disparities we see in education mirror the disparities that exist throughout our society. Right? And in fact, it would be remarkable if the kids who not only were in underfunded schools, but also in segregated neighborhoods with with inadequate housing, with the highest homeless rates, with the worst health conditions, if they were doing just as well in school as the kids who have everything, that would be a real story to write, right? But we don't look at those connections. We just look at achievement, right? And we ignore these bigger connections. So that's a story. The other story that's interesting is what I would call positive deviance. Where are the exceptions and why? How do we explain it? How do we explain, for example, why Canada has no black ghettos? Right? You could go to Detroit, which is a city that's one of our greatest cities, literally just fallen apart, and cross the river to Windsor, Ontario, and you will find a thriving black community. How come Windsor is thriving and Detroit is dying until now it's being gentrified? That's an interesting story. And black kids there do really well. What are Canadians doing differently? Right? Why don't we ask that question? Right? Why is it when we talk about Compton, we talk about all the problems, and we don't look at all the amazing, talented people that have come out of Compton despite the poverty in Compton? Right? And I can name, from the Williams sisters to Kendrick Lamar, who just won the Pulitzer Prize, they're all from Compton, and they're not all athletes. Right? What is there that allows some people to be so resilient despite those challenges? That's a great story to write.
I think there are two things that I would want to put on the table. One is that, you all are reporting, the question is who's reading what you're reporting. I mean, the reality of it is that, unless I'm wrong, things have changed in terms of how people get their information, what impact that information has on the decision-making, that takes place. The second thing is, I always begin with the assumption that the body politic doesn't care about poor people. We write these articles like people care about this, and in my view, people don't care. And that one of the responsibilities that those of us have who do care is to continue to fight just so that these voices can even be heard. And I'm not at all, I just don't believe that the kids in my school, that the people who control the political and economic apparatus in this country, they don't care about these kids. And so for us, teaching is almost like a revolutionary act, right? Because these school systems were never set up in the beginning to have people be able to control their own lives. And so we keep asking a system that was never set up for the purposes that we now wanted to serve a different purpose. And so I think when you're writing and thinking about these things, it's important to understand the foundations for the oppression. And we sort of mentioned there's schools, there's housing, there's this, there's that. But like Derek Bell in his book Faces of the Bottom of the Well made the point that racism, for example, in this country is not some tangential thing. It's really woven into the fabric of American society. That it has a permanence that many of us are not prepared to realize. And so if that's true, what then will the struggles look like for your generation? Because I've been at this like for 50 years, and the thing that bothers me is I'm hearing the same things over and over again. Y'all got new words, microaggressions, safe spaces. Y'all talk about all this stuff, right? And it's all good. But what it is a regurgitation of the same reality. And it may show itself in some different forms, but the foundations for it remain the same.
I do need to say, as much as I agree with Howard in general, on that last point, the greatest president in the history of the United States, President Barack Obama, did care very much about education, and it was my deep, deep pleasure to be able to be aggressive on his behalf, working directly in school.
But see, I think that I actually agree that Obama was there. I want to be clear. We had differences or whatever on issues, but there's no doubt that he fundamentally cared. The question is, why are the conditions of the poorest of our people the same? And now you got somebody who not only doesn't care, he's antagonistic to poor people and people of color. I mean, people often ask me why do I talk about this, or what is this all about? If somebody becomes the president of the United States and says, my goal is to take America back, the question is from whom? And if there's data out there that says by 2044, for the first time, white people in this country are going to be a minority, and you have somebody who comes in and says, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put all of these black and brown people I can out, I'm going to stop them from coming in, and then we're going to go to Norway. What does that signal? Right? So what I'm saying is that if we're going to start reporting about schools and this and that, there's a larger framework here that we have to address.
So Kathryn, this may or may not lead into that a little bit, but the commission has called on Congress to offer states incentives to adopt finance systems and incentives or whatever. But every time we come across this issue, we bump up against these two words, local control. And for these people, many of whom cover education in their local communities, this balance between the fact that in many ways the country doesn't want to, sort of set a bar across the nation, but we've decided we're going to leave it to 50 states and 14,000 districts. And I just wonder how you guys sort of frame that in this equity discussion and how it might be useful to these folks.
Well, the Commission's calling on Congress to incentivize equity is recognizing the existence of local control and the primacy of local control in the country. It's calling on incentivizing it so that our local communities can take those incentives and run with them. I do want to say that we have opposing and equally effective thoughts on this, both a belief in local decision making where it can be effective and a firm 60-year commitment to a federal backstop on core civil rights issues. So that while we have long had a commitment to local control, and we certainly hear more and more about that in this administration than I think is wise, we also have never wavered in the 60 years since the 1964 Civil Rights Act from the fundamental principle that there is a meaningful federal backstop for our core equity principles, and that it is important to achieve those equity principles through federal enforcement. And our greatest successes have been when we've had aggressive federal role. We see an administration moving away from that in a way that I think is deeply, deeply dangerous. And we see a bipartisan Congress deciding to override those recommendations from this administration and instead to add additional dollars to the Federal Office for Civil Rights to make sure that there is still a possibility for meaningful federal enforcement, notwithstanding what this administration has asked for. So I think that there's a tension about it. There's really no question that local control, absent a federal backstop, is a failed civil rights policy, period. It's not an open question. It's something that has not worked for us in the country. We absolutely cannot walk away from it. And we're not walking away from it except in the rhetoric in this administration.
So let me offer a slightly different take on that, because while I totally agree with Kathryn about the historic role of the federal government in protecting civil rights, I would also say it's been a role that they haven't always taken on. We haven't even mentioned the name Betsy DeVos today. There was a sighting of her in New York yesterday at a Jewish Orthodox school. Still hasn't been to a underperforming public school, as she admitted on 60 Minutes. But so that role is important, but at the same time, I think local control is one of the few bright spots I see also. Because I see in different parts of the country, red and blue states, I see communities that have acted on the Promised Neighborhood Initiative to do things that states and the federal government are not encouraging. So, for example, Tulsa, I mentioned Oklahoma this morning. Tulsa has more kids in preschool than any other city in the United States. Every school is a full-service school, and their premier public high school is 50% black. Tulsa. Now, that to me is worthy of some attention. How did Tulsa happen to pursue that? I was given a tour of Tulsa by a former member of the city council who was also a Republican and retired police officer. And he took me to Greenwood. Greenwood was the black section of Tulsa that burned in 1924 during the so-called race riots. And he said to me, we didn't get reparations back then for what happened here to these people. He said, but we will get better schools for these kids. And I said, you're talking about reparations? He said, that's right, because that's what was needed. This is a Republican city councilman in Tulsa. So when you start to go into communities, you see the good and the bad of local control. But to me, particularly now with a federal government that is so lax or absent in these issues and providing leadership, in some ways, local leadership is the only leadership we have.
We reported a lot from Tulsa and talking about universal preschool, and it seems like preschool and the activity that's happening not at the federal level, but the states and local governments in terms of establishing universal preschool is one of the most kind of important equity sort of responses or solutions that's happening right now. And I just wonder, are there other places where you see, whether it's access to college or 8th grade algebra or whatever, are there other areas where you see positive signs in terms of districts or communities or states sort of moving that is having an impact on this issue that we're talking about today?
I mean, one of the real pleasures of having been doing federal civil rights enforcement was that we got to see the good, the bad, the ugly, right? And in the course of doing that enforcement work, we would see schools that were beating out, to Pedro's point, about lifting up the places that are doing it anyway. And just to take one concrete example, that we were doing an investigation of Lynchburg, Virginia schools about hybrid course access in those schools. And in the course of that investigation, and we had real concerns about what was happening in the district, we found one school in the district that had decided on its own, they brought in a new principal and they decided on its own that they were going to really change the way that they were offering schooling, so that they had kids come in off-cycle times to do remedial work. They changed their school discipline policies. They changed their access to higher order coursework so that all kids had access to it. And the kids were thriving, they were succeeding, they were doing unbelievably well. So whereas we, in the course of our investigation, had real concerns about other schools in that same district, there was a school in the district that you could point to say, this is the model, this is how you could do it. And we didn't direct it. They were doing it on their own because they came up with the choice. And so there can be local decision making that's incredibly effective and that is inspiring, that shows the proof points of what can work. And then what you want to do is to see more places follow. And sometimes it takes a push to get those other places to follow. Because in this Lynchburg example, the other schools in the same district that had this proof model already there weren't doing what this school was doing. And the district wasn't incentivizing their doing it. But it took a federal agreement to get that.
And then we, just by nature and because it's public funding and everything, we tend to talk a whole lot about K-12. And I just wonder what you guys, I don't like to just ask you to riff on stuff, but just where you see the touch points or pressure points or what the opportunities or what the story ideas for that you would see in higher education in terms of this equity questions and equity discussions.
And higher ed.
Yeah, in higher ed. Most of these are I'm a K-12 guy, and so I'm always just trying to remember, oh, we have to cover higher ed too, and those issues, I mean, it's funny, very different than the preschool discussion that's happening. And so I just wonder where the stories are and where the issues are, what you guys think.
Well, just to take a very timely example today, there's news today that Michigan State University is paying $500 million to survivors of Larry Nassar's sexual violence abuse. And that's a jaw-dropping sum. It's an extraordinary penalty. Let me say that if they had effective policies in place for the decades over which Larry Nassar had an opportunity to harm the many, many, many people that he harmed, they wouldn't have gotten to a place where they had to pay that enormous outlay of money. So the story there is, how do you achieve equity now? How do you put policies in place now that prevent that kind of jaw-dropping, shocking outlay of funds and also harm that was allowed to perpetuate because we didn't look and we weren't willing to be thoughtful enough. But we as a national community weren't willing to be thoughtful enough about what was happening in the schools. And I think that's just a huge eye-opener that we get and that is a takeaway from that very, very large sum of money that is now being paid out. Because that school is not alone in terms of the kinds of harms that can run rampant.
So here's a higher ed story that gets some attention but not enough. Across the country, graduation rates have been rising. Right? It's about 80% now, which is significant. However, the number of students who are required to take remedial courses in community college is still very high. Those students get stuck in most places in those courses for which they're not getting credit and end up dropping out of school. So a number of districts, California is a leader in this, are looking at new ways to address what didn't happen in high school. Right? The fact that these kids are coming to college, they haven't had the math or in some cases the writing either, and now what they're doing is they're not lowering the bar, but they're changing the strategy to address the learning deficit. Right? There are many districts, this one in particular, LA Unified, that's been celebrating its rising graduation rates and hasn't really reflected on the large number of kids who are actually now prepared for college. That's a great story to look at because it has huge equity implications.
So, you brought it up, Pedro. Betsy DeVos leads logically, and since Howard Fuller is here and he's been very involved in this, I want to ask about school choice in the context of the equity discussion in the school choice, and I can ask specific stuff, but just, you know, we can cite stories that say, oh, the charters or choice are increasing opportunities and giving students from low-income families or students from minority families greater choice and opportunity. Also, we've all seen and done stories that say, oh, it's harming our efforts within the public system to provide greater equity. Anyway, let's start with you, Howard, and maybe just talk about where you see the touch points right now and where you see the story ideas in terms of school choice or how we should be, you know, in this administration framing our reporting on school choice.
Okay, I just want to be clear. I'm a supporter of parent choice. I have been, and Robin is sitting here who's going to do a book on Polly Williams, who is a person who all of you all should know and many of you probably never heard of, because so much of what has happened today is because of the courage of Polly Williams. So let me just explain why I support what I support, and I don't expect people to agree with me. You know, you can believe whatever.
We should just say she was a famous lawmaker, a state lawmaker in Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, Polly Williams was a black Democrat who, back in 1988, took the position, along with a lot of us, that the Milwaukee Public Schools was not going to educate poor black children. And since they weren't going to educate black children, we actually tried to create our own district. And when they didn't let us do that, then we said, let us out of here. And so it wasn't like I was sitting in the basement or Polly was sitting in the basement reading Milton Friedman to, you know, like, oh my God. No, it came as a process of our own struggle. And we've always seen parent choice within the context of a social justice issue, not an issue of markets and all of this, right? People, so let me just be clear. I believe that if you live in America and you got money, you got choice. Because everybody who's sitting in here know that when you down to the nub about your own children, you're gonna do whatever it takes to take care of your children. And if you got money in America and schools don't work for your children, you either gonna move to communities where they do work, you're gonna put your kids in private schools, or you're gonna get the most expensive tutoring on the planet, and you don't care what government reports come out. The people who suffer in this country are low-income and working-class people who are forced to stay in schools that didn't work for them, don't work for their children, and ain't gonna work for their grandchildren. And so you got people teaching in schools that they would never put their own children in, demanding that other people's children stay there so they can get paid to put their kids in private schools. Now, I've never known a public policy that only has an upside. Every public policy I've ever heard of has an upside and a downside. So too is parent choice. It is not all upside. There are downsides to it. But if you're intellectually honest at the moment in history in which you live, you have to decide whether or not the upside outweighs the downside. The last point I would make, because I don't feel too strongly about this, but
Don't sugarcoat it, please.
I listen to people talk about the traditional public school system. I've been a superintendent, right? I've been a superintendent of Milwaukee Public Schools. I actually support traditional public school systems because I don't think it's in our interest for any system not to be working for our children. And I know that there are people who support parent choice who don't support it for the same reasons that I do. And I understand that. But I had people when I was a superintendent who were working inside of MPS and doing damage to our children every single day. Doing damage to our children every single day. And those parents had no options. They had nowhere to go. They had no power to come up with something different for their children. So, and then if y'all want, I can, because I know I should say something about Betsy DeVos since Pedro threw it in there, but I'll save that if y'all have any questions. But that's my position on parent
Choice?
Sure, so I can argue both sides of the issue, I often do. And I agree with what Howard said. Middle class, affluent people always have choice, even if it's to move, right, or to put their kids in private school. Joe Nocera, who used to write, Wall Street Journal, wrote a great piece several years ago about how the middle class helped ruin public schools by choosing to leave, right? And so that to me is an important issue, but I think there's other important issues. and that is what happens when we have systems that only serve the most disadvantaged children, which is what we have in almost every city across the country. Is there any way to ensure quality for them? And I don't see much evidence that we can or that we do. So we have a political policy problem on our hands because we have such deeply entrenched inequities in our system. And so I think you have to look at the issue in a multifaceted way. You have to look at the interests of parents. You have to ask questions about how well are kids being served? And then you have to ask questions of public responsibility. What's the responsibility of government to ensure that your neighborhood should not determine what kind of schools you have access to? I would say, for a long time, I've been in New York, and the most equitable institution in this country is the New York subway system. Because it doesn't matter where you get on, you pay the same price. It's more or less safe, more or less clean, exception of a few rats here and there. And regardless of the neighborhood, you're going to get the same service. That's the way schools should be. But it's not like that. In every city across the country, if you're in a poor neighborhood, you're going to see a crappy school, but we're more likely to blame the kids and the families than the institutions and ask why is it that they have schools that don't offer lab science, they don't offer the courses kids even need to be able to get to college. Those basic inequity questions that Kathryn has documented so well are rarely part of the public policy debate. Instead, we say choice will save us when we know very well if it does work, it's saving a few. Meanwhile, the rest are still relegated to that inferior education.
Which, and that's an important point. That's why I think we have to make a distinction between public education and the systems that deliver it. Because they're not the same things. The Milwaukee public school system is not public education, it's a delivery system. And since these delivery systems were not created by God, we could actually change them. The question is how to change them so that the poorest children have a chance, right? That's always going to be what drives me. And there are aspects of parent choice that I oppose universal vouchers, for example. Because like my social psychologist is Chris Rock, so that tells you the level I'm operating at, right? So, Chris Rock was like, in America, there's like, if you got money, you like right here. If you don't got money, you like right here. I did not get in this battle to do this. I got in it to do this. Because my question is, because I believe that there are these different delivery systems, I know for a fact that if we don't figure out how to educate these kids and give them a chance, there is another public system waiting for them, and it's called prisons. And so I'm willing to fight at every level that I can. And the last point I want to make is, and this is important, is when people talk about states' rights, local rights, all this, I don't believe in none of these. Because all of them can oppress you. The question is, at a given moment in history, which one do you have the best chance of trying to do the best that we can for our children? None of them are perfect. All of them can be used in ways that were not intended when they were first started. There's so many laws that have been passed that were intended to help us that are now used against us. And so for me, it's like a constant analysis of what is working here, why is this working, what can we use, why this, why not that, and I don't believe in any one way of trying to approach this.
Kathryn, quick thoughts on choice, or we can move to the questions.
Try to be fast, and I think we're in expressing anyway heated agreement, except for the Chris Rock as the social psychologist. I sat on the charter school board when I lived in Los Angeles. I defended the existence of the Magnet Schools program, which we haven't talked about as a form of choice, when I was here in Los Angeles, against segregation impulses in this state. And obviously, I support and believe in and defend the existence of traditional public schools. My strongest view is that all of us want to be able to express choice for our families. We want to be able to support that, and not every one of us has the capacity, the time, the inclination to use choice, and we need to make sure that all kids have access to meaningful public education, and we shouldn't be saying that there's one or another way to access it. I'm going to tell you just one story of one kid from one of my cases that really typifies for me why we can't rely on that choice. And this was a case in which students in California public schools had profoundly unequal educational opportunities. my lead plaintiff that I was working with. I'd been interviewing her, learning facts at her school. She's 12 years old. She didn't have a book to take home. She'd never had a book to take home as a public school student. I talked to her mom to get her mom to sign the paperwork I needed to be able to litigate the case. And her mom said, I think she's just lazy. This kid was amazing. This kid was amazing. She was such a fighter. She was such a believer in school. She so badly wanted to learn. Her mother had multiple jobs. Her mother didn't have time to be focused on this student's acquisition in school. And her experience in school was that her daughter was lazy because her school wasn't prepared for her. That mom wasn't going to use choice if choice had been available to her. That wasn't going to get equity for Olivia. But what got out equity for Olivia was litigation to make her school ready for her, because that's the school that she was assigned to. I think you have to do all those fronts for equity.
That raises like 27 questions for me, and I'm going to shut up here. And we have 20 minutes left, and I want to open it up to the floor. Lori's got the microphone. Please wait for the mic to come around if you're next, and then just say who you are real quick, and then just be mindful of time. Thanks.
Hi, David DeRoche, Connecticut Public Radio. Howard, something you said struck with me, that it's just important to keep elevating these voices, making sure people's voices are heard. But he also said that the body politic doesn't care. And I'm wondering, is it important that they do? Should we try to get them to care? Is it important that they care to really solve these problems, or should we just keep telling these stories?
You know what? You don't want to tell stories just to be telling stories. I mean, the idea is that you want it to have some impact. And what I would argue is, although I'm fundamentally a pessimist, I still get up every day to fight, right? And I believe something that Derek Bell said. He said that you have to fight even when victory is not possible, because not to fight is to co-sign on the injustice. And so from my standpoint, these stories must be told. Whether or not they are being listened to at a moment in history, we have to keep telling them, and we have to keep pressing, because we can't just stop. You know what I mean? We can't just accept this and say that it's okay. And so I didn't mean to imply that the stories are not important, because I think they are. I think your voices are important as a part of a larger reality. And I'm reading this book right now, New Power, and so it's got me kind of like trying to figure out how we're actually going to make change in this particular moment in history.
I have just a quick thought. It's not my panel, but I'm going to tell you a quick thought about how we do our job. I think if we're not careful, stories about this topic, stories about poverty and inequity, can sound, I think of this in NPR, can sound an awful lot like stories people feel like they ought to listen to instead of stories that they want to listen to. And I think we do that sometimes by, one, is with the language sometimes, of conflating the words like poor and minority almost comes out one word sometimes, poor and minority. And then these stories can be stories about them. Whereas if we tell the stories and do our jobs and tell those stories and make these people human beings so that we realize, oh, we have connections with, sort of the middle class, we think a lot about our audience at NPR. If we do stories that show us the similarities and the commonalities between the struggles that people are having to get a good education with their kids, rather than sort of focusing on the differences, I don't know if that makes sense to you guys, but it's something we think a lot.
So I would say, knowing what I do about Connecticut, that the challenge for a journalist is to tell the story in a way that makes people listen. Right? So Connecticut, like New Jersey, spends more money than any other state in the country, but you have every urban area has intractable problems. But then you also have CERC, right? Those integrated schools right outside of outside of Hartford that have done incredibly well. That's a story, but this way to tell the story is, what's the implications for the quality of life in Connecticut if we were to do that elsewhere? That is, appeal to people's economic interests. Here's the truth of America. Increasingly, as the older white population becomes dependent upon their Social Security and pensions, they're going to be dependent on young black and brown kids to work to support them. They need to understand that even if they don't care about those kids, it's in the economic interest to care about them, to make sure they get a good education, because they're the future workers who will support them in their retirement. So find other angles to get them to get it, so that they understand their property taxes, their home values are all affected by what's happening in cities. They can't simply write them off as they have in Connecticut and elsewhere.
Great, where are we going, Lori? Oh, hey.
Hi, Chastity Pratt from Bridge Magazine in Detroit. Question about school choice. Howard, it had to be 20 years ago when I saw you in a setting like this, when charter schools were really wrapping up, and I remember you making an analogy about charter schools, saying something to the effect that you might even invoke Harriet Tubman in this one, saying something to the effect of, you know, charter schools are going to be an opportunity for parents to escape the things in traditional schools that are not working for them and their children. And so here in Detroit, you know Detroit very well. We're worst performing urban district in America, and half our kids go to charters, half traditional. We've been up this issue one side and down the other. So the question is, knowing what we know about the results in our urban areas with charter schools and choice and traditionals, knowing what we know about where we want these children to go eventually educationally, what's next? We've been covering this for 20 years. What's next in school choice coverage? Where do we really need to be focusing our reporting efforts when it comes to school choice at this point?
You know, I actually think I'm not the one to say what's next. I really think the next generation's got to say what's next. You know what I'm saying? I mean, what I want to be able to do is to pass on the lessons that I've learned. But I think what's next is dependent upon how this generation sees its struggle. Francis Fanon wrote this book called Pedro De Guerra. And then he said that every generation out of relative obscurity must discover its mission and either fulfill it or betray it. So the question is, those of us who fought this long have brought this to a certain point. Some of us going to just fight till they drag us out. I'm one of those. But the reality of it is that it's going to be a new generation that has to define how this is going to roll forward in the next period.
I do think you also need to write the story, though. And so what you just described about what we've learned and what we know now, that's really important. And not treating charter schools or school choice as a monolith, but that there are lots of different components of that, making sure that people have that information and understand what it is that we're looking at. So we are building on the history that we have lived up to now.
And since you're from Michigan, and so is Betsy DeVos, what better place to really examine the track record, right? The track record, because I'll be in Detroit tomorrow, actually. It's ugly, right? And it's ironic that we would hold this up as a national model when you see so many examples of scandal, of unfulfilled promises. So, I mean, it is a mixed bag, but that story needs to be told because it's one way of holding our elected or appointed officials accountable for their track record.
Detroit's fourth grade reading scores for black children is higher than Milwaukee, just so you know. So when you start saying Detroit is the worst place, Milwaukee's fourth grade reading scores are lower than Detroit's.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Chandra Thomas Whitfield. I'm a freelance journalist based in Denver, and I'm also a EWA fellow working on a project with EWA. And I primarily work with NBC, News.com, The Undefeated, Ebony, and whoever else paid. My question is, my project is about the lack of diversity in the K-12 teacher workforce, particularly the lack of black teachers. And as we all know, there's more black and brown students, actually more than ever. We also know, as we said in the earlier session, that somewhere between 78 to 80% of the teachers are white female. We also know that kids of color, and all kids, but kids of color in particular, who have these gaps, perform better when they have a teacher that look like them. So my question is, outside of just kind of saying we need more teachers, how do we need to address this? And is this truly an equity issue, and should it be addressed in the framework of, say, a civil rights issue if we know that these kids are struggling, but we're also not providing what we know works for them?
Of course, it's an equity issue, and it's an equity issue for all kids, because certainly there's the research about how kids who see people who look like them as leaders perform better, but there's also research about how all kids perform better when they think of a multicultural leadership, a multicultural future as a place that they will grow into and be part of. So this is a core equity issue for all of us. The reality is that the United States Supreme Court and Congress over time have really narrowed the tools available for going directly at this issue. That does not mean that there are not tools still available. So we need to be talking about it, we need to be thinking about it, and we ought to be using levers that we do have. And they are clear. choices about how we recruit teachers, there's choices about how we pay our teachers, there's choices about the working conditions that we deliver for our teachers, and there's choices about what message we send about what it is that we want in our schools. And we need to be explicit, conscious, and visible about all of those points, because otherwise it will not change. And it is now at a crisis point in this country in terms of who actually stands in front of the classroom and teaches our children. So it's a really core issue that we can address. We have more limited tools, legal tools, to use to address them, but they are not gone.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Reese Harris. I'm a reporter with the Clarion Ledger in Mississippi. The question that I have for you all is if you could just share some thoughts on using standardized test scores to help frame reporting on inequity.
You've heard on this panel that we've done a bit to say are a marker of achievement. They are not a marker of equity. They are not a marker of opportunity available to students, and it's a really important divide, and that is enormously frustrating to me that we don't capture that better as a country. The civil rights data collection newly in this newest round has new indicators about opportunity for students in schools. That's a place I hope you all will use. They just came out. That data needs to be mined about what access kids do and don't have to 8th grade algebra, to other high-rigor courses, who's taking them, who's passing them, are they offered in sequence, do the teachers have training to be able to teach them, all of the components that follow on that. That's about what kind of opportunities are available to kids in school. And if more kids have more of those opportunities, more of those kids will achieve. But if we don't look at whether they have those opportunities, then we are ignoring why there is a huge achievement gap deficit.
You know, I'm glad this question came up because we haven't talked about No Child Behind and why it is that there became gradually a backlash against it. And started in affluent communities against the testing. But I would say that its most pernicious effects were felt in poor and urban areas. Now, as a researcher, I like to look at test scores because it gives us some parameter to get a sense of how things are going. At the same time, Kathryn said, I'm always skeptical of what they actually mean. And I think that skepticism is important to kind of probe behind what does it really tell us about a reading level for a student, for example, or about their opportunity to learn. So I don't want to dismiss the value of the scores per se, but I do want to say that it doesn't tell us enough. Going the next layer to understand what's behind it, what explains it, is really important. I just have to ask, is that George Miller back there? It is. He's one of the former congressmen who was one of the authors of No Child Behind. Good to see you. I didn't mean to out you, but.
My name is Alejandra Matos. I'm a reporter at the Houston Chronicle. I cover politics, but education policy is one of my focuses. So your comment about the choice to move, that's a choice. I have a colleague who is moving to the other part of the city because where he lives doesn't have an orchestra. Obviously, that's something that he is able to do. But are there things, and it made, your comment made me think, oh, let's look at schools that have these sorts of resources and how they compare. Are there 2 or 3 ideas that you have for reporters, things that they should look at to see if schools are equitable or not, whether it's access to clubs and extracurricular activities? What are some other things we should be looking at?
I have to say goodbye, everybody, because I have a teacher class UCLA. So
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So we really should be looking at the indicators in the school itself, and that means what is their discipline policy, who gets disciplined and how, what courses do they offer? Do they offer enough of them in sequence for all the students to take them? What is the racial demographic of the student population? What is the racial demographic of the teacher population? And what is the full complement of kinds of courses that are offered in schools? It is astonishing to me the ways that we still find segregation in schools that have promised courts, that they will no longer segregate. One of the cases that I resolved with the Department of Education early in my time was a case in an Alabama school district that had achieved unitary status, which means that they'd gotten out from under a long-standing desegregation order. The school district was 23% black. One of their 4 high schools was more than 90% black. So that begs the question in itself, whether they actually were unitary. That high school had never offered a single advanced placement course until 3 years before we began investigating. And when they offered their first advanced placement course, they did it online with no teacher. And they weren't doing international baccalaureate, they weren't doing dual enrollment, they just did not have higher courses at that school. That principal said to my staff that he didn't offer it at that school because these kids need remedial education. all of them. Not a single one of them would have been able to achieve in a high rigor course. That's the kind of thing we need to be reporting on, looking at. What is it that we communicate in our expectations in schools? What is it that we say to our kids when we don't offer algebra, when we don't offer calculus? 50% of the United States high schools don't offer a single calculus course to anyone. And then that doesn't get underneath it, whether they offer the courses that you need to take to be able to be ready for it up until the time you would get to calculus, and whether they offer it to enough of the students who might want to achieve in those schools. So looking at all of those elements is really, really critical.
You know, I would say two things. One is I wish some of these people would give some of you all the time to spend an entire year in a school so that you can actually understand what happens in a school. What happens with the kids, what happens with the principal, what happens with the teacher, what happens with the janitor. Because I can tell you, because I spend most of my time when I'm in Milwaukee in our school, and my whole view of the world is shaped differently because of that experience. Because I'm constantly exposed to these kids' real lives and to the struggles that teachers have, you know, trying to really deal with these kids. The second thing that I would hope that you could do is to push back against the false choices that America forces us to make. We've decided, for example, now that early childhood education is the most important thing. Well, what about the kids who are already in the pipeline that we're not educating? And by the way, who do you think the parents will be of the early childhood people? And so what this country forces us to do is to say we got to take one or the other. And so all of a sudden we get a greater bang for the buck by going into early childhood. I support early childhood, but I support middle school students. I support high school students. And we need to push back against this notion that it's about resources. It's not about resources. It's about how we choose to use resources in this country. And until we start pushing back against some of this and just accept all this as a given, they're going to continue to put us in this situation of making false choices.
I hate to say it because I see hands up all over the room, and we can do this all day long. Last question. Where are we?
Hi, I'm Jen Smith. I'm a reporter for the Berkshire Eagle in the Berkshires of Massachusetts, which is the non-Boston side. And so my question is in regards to that question. I mean, we're just talking about distribution of resources, but a lot of times the policy that happens in our state is on the opposite side of where we need resources, and our schools are constantly told we'd like to do that, but we don't have the funding. And so they're closing schools or consolidating. There's just growing incentive to consolidate. So is there any other policies that you're seeing that protect our smaller schools? Yes, they're smaller populations, but they still need resources that the bigger city schools do that have larger problems as well.
So I am not aware of effective policies that address the school finance inequity that you're talking about, but I am aware of much research that supports exactly the problem that you're talking about and calls for our policymakers to do a better job. But the reality is that we don't now have the political will actually to address the profound school finance inequity that has persisted over decades and that operates to the detriment of the kids exactly as you described.
I hate to say it, but our time has run out. We need to move on to more exciting sessions. Thanks to you both. That was